So, good morning. I'm in Portland, Oregon, which is the left coast of the US, and I hope you get some value from this workshop. So, basically, I'm going to be talking about disruption, disruption in general, disruption of verticals, disruption in organizations, and personal disruption. And part of that is I'm hopefully going to offer some tips, tools, and solutions. So let's get into it. But before I jump into it, I want to do a quick story. At first, I thought this was humorous, but I became a little bit more serious when I filled up my gas tank. Fred asked me about 2 months ago to give a talk. So I said, sure, why not? It'll be fun. And one of the things I put in the description was $10 gallon of gas. And I thought, at that time, gas was running around $3.90, $4 in the Northwest. And I thought, what are the chances of gas becoming $10 a gallon within 2 months? Well, Northern California, Mendocino County, there is a town where the average cost of a gallon of gas is, guess what? $9.50. So I thought worst case scenario might be at the end of the year where we'd see that, but things are accelerating very, very quickly. So let's see. Who am I? Here's a sort of a brief bio. So a little bit of introduction. I've been in this business a long time. We've been basically promoting, advocating, evangelizing that the future of quality, and probably any profession, is risk. We've done a lot of stuff in terms of homeland security, auditing, assurance. Spent the last 20 years actually doing homeland security, forensics, assurance, and analytics. So I've been in this business a long time. Now, I guess that's the point of this slide. So just in case, if I'm boring you to death, here are the 5 takeaways for the entire talk today. We're living in a VUCA world, and VUCA is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. All life and work is being disrupted. Risk is a new lens for working and living, not only at work, not only for our professions or jobs, but really for everything. And then finally, the 2 big takeaways. All management is now risk management, and the future quality and reliability is risk. And on the right, you can see a couple pictures. Unfortunately, we have the Ukraine war. We have the COVID virus. We have an evergreen ship basically blocking the Suez Canal. And especially in the Northwest, we have fires. And of course, fires up in the Northwest, we've always had, but for some reason, in the last 5-10 years, they've accelerated. So if there's anything that we can leave, these are the 5 points we want to talk about, and we'll be talking about them for the next 30, 35 minutes. So here's our presentation outline. We're going to cover 3 big topics: context, challenge, and response. I'm going to talk about, first of all, context. I had a boss a lot of years ago who said context for any problem is worth 20 IQ points. And since he was my boss, I think I got it. And the context of this talk is disruption, and frankly, of everything, is a new normal. One of the things that you may want to do is just take a look almost at anything, your work, your job, even going to the store, and look at things from a disruptive lens, a risk lens, from what happened pre-COVID to where we are now. Look at the delta, and the delta basically is the disruption from now to what we had before pre-COVID. The second piece of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the challenges. Risk is the lens for looking at life and work, and then the response will be the solutions that we'll be talking about in this talk, specifically risk-based problem solving and risk-based decision-making. So let's dive into it. First of all, what's disruption? Disruption has a lot of definitions. It basically means different things to different people. But for our more technical conversation today, and I like to make it a conversation. So if you have questions, please put it in the chat or bring it up with me or bring it up with Fred, because we really like this, like your comments. So from a technical point of view, we look at disruption in terms of 4 criteria, 4 factors: boundary conditions, rules, expectations, and tools and technology. So just in terms of this example, and I'm using this example because I've got a 22-year-old going to college right now and graduating. And a lot of these points I think are really relevant to me right now. So I'm going to talk about and basically offer an example in terms of boundary conditions. Pre-COVID, most college education was on campus. Now, most of it or a lot of it is moving online. The rules: most colleges required vaccinations before students can take campus classes. Expectations: I think now, especially with high student loans, parents expect value. I expect value from my daughter's education. So there's a lot more what I would call emphasis on return on investment. And the 4th factor we look at in terms of disruption is that most learning tools 5 years ago were basically school-based or on-site based. Now, almost all of them are online tools and technologies. So the bottom line is disruption is impacting higher education, it's impacting teaching, and as we'll talk about in this talk, disruption is occurring all over the place, especially in our profession. So here's an example, and I'm going to talk about this example. Last September, we started a project with Oregon State University. Now, on the bottom of the slide, and I'm not going to read it, you can read it, there's some future of work statistics, again, disruption. But a little background on this project. Oregon State has the biggest program in the world for computer science. They're probably ranked in the top 15% worldwide. And we had a project with them basically to develop a future of work app. And we started the app, and that's one reason why a lot of examples in this talk address education. If you're interested in the full description, visit that URL on the bottom. But the bottom line is most higher education institutions are rebranding and focusing on the future of work, and especially making their graduates more employable. So another disruption I'd like to talk about is work. You can take a look at the statistics here. I'm not going to read them, but it'll give you an impression. I'm not going to read any of the slides. If you're interested in the slide deck, please reach out to Fred and he'll send you the slide deck. Also, a plug for Fred's Ascendo Reliability. If you're not a member, if you're not an affiliate, if you're not working with Fred, please do it. He's got the best site, bar none, on reliability and probably quality in the world right now. So you can see basically what's happening. And by the way, the source of this is McKinsey a couple months ago. Again, more disruption and more what I would call personal disruption. Now I'm going to talk about organizational disruption. And there's a lot I can talk about in this slide, but the horizontal axis is time. The vertical axis is VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And we have 2 graphs or 2 lines. The horizontal line, which is dotted, shows internal processes, which are Six Sigma based. Many organizations, especially us in quality and reliability, have focused on consistency of product quality, consistency in processes, consistency in suppliers, consistency in the delivery of product just in time. That's the essence of lean. That's the essence of Six Sigma. is you define a target and you minimize variation around that target so that the process becomes stable, statistically stable, capable of meeting requirements, and improving, meaning minimizing variation. And that's basically our operating model in reliability and quality. But here's the disruption. The external factors hitting an organization, meaning outside in, are causing disruption. And you can see that in the delta, in the gap between the solid line and the dotted line. That gap, you can think of variation, a delta, or a risk. And those risks you can see on the right-hand side of the graph are gaps. The greater the gaps, the more variation, the more disruption. Quite often it's outside in. And you can see that variation will be in work, cost, schedule, scope, technology, and quality. And again, a lot of the things that we learn in lean, reliability, quality, focus on consistency, internal consistency. But again, what do we do when we have that outside in disruption? And that's happening in all organizations. So let's look at what's happening in the quality reliability professions. So a quick story. A few years ago, I was working on an AI project. It was a national AI project that probably would impact 100,000 people in a vertical. And I was the lead PI, the risk PI, principal investigator. And basically what we wanted to do was come up with a tool, a machine that would help in the decision-making of people in this job. So basically what you have in your pocket right now with your smartphone is you have all the information in the world basically available at your fingertips through your smartphone. But here's the key disruptor. What do you do when all the information of your work, career, job is available on your work, job, career smartphone? For lack of anything better, let's call it your work, career, job, Siri or Alexa. And what do you do when that smartphone starts making decisions? So what's going to be your personal differentiator in life, in your job, and your career? And what we're positing, what we're presenting, and what we're offering you in this workshop is a solution that we're going to talk about. And I think the differentiator, at least for the next 10 years, will be your ability as a human to do risk-based problem solving and risk-based decision-making. That will be the differentiator until these machines become smart and independent and can make decisions on their own. We're not there yet, but I think we might be coming. So a quick story. This just happened 2 days ago. An engineer at Google basically said publicly that their AI system, artificial intelligence system, is sentient. Basically, it can think on its own, and it has a soul of its own, and it has a body, a spiritual body of its own. Well, of course, Google didn't like that. What did they do? Basically fired the guy. We're reaching a point where the machines are becoming very, very smart. And what are we going to do with them? What are the rules of interaction? What are the rules of engagement with the machines? Anyway, something to think about. But more importantly, the question that I would pose to you right now is, what is your personal differentiator from the smart machine over the next 5 to 10 years? And I hopefully will offer some solutions to that. So let's look at some of the disruptions facing quality, ISO, and reliability. And of course, since most of my professional background is, at least in the last first 10 years of my life, was in quality, I'll be talking about that. I'm going to talk about really 3 disruptions facing the quality profession. One is, what's the risk definition? What's the definition of risk? What's risk-based thinking? And why is the entire ISO structure really crumbling right now? Meaning, why are certification bodies, CBs, issuing conformance certificates when they shouldn't? So let's dive into this. This is interesting. ISO 31000 is the international risk standard, and it defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Simple definition, effect of uncertainty. But there's only one problem. An objective is immutable. It does not change. How can uncertainty affect a document or immutable standard? It can't. So here's the disruption. How have companies over maybe say 2 million operationalized this definition over the last 7 years? They've had a very hard time. And part of it, I think, is when ISO and quality and reliability defined risk, they defined it improperly. And what we've been doing, at least our company, is we're defining risk as the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of objectives. Now, why is that? Why do we add those two words and it makes things different? Well, first of all, the achievement of an objective makes sense. An objective is immutable, it doesn't change. But the achievement of the objective is variable and it can change. So obviously, adding those two words implies that risk now is measurable and auditable against business and quality objectives. So just to give you an example, ISO 31000 was written in 2018, 4 years ago. Just last month, the US TAG Technical Advisory Group to ISO basically said, oops, we made an error. That error we made is we defined risk in the standard improperly. And this is a big deal because it impacts over 2 million companies. We defined risk improperly. I think we should add those two words, achievement of. Now, all of a sudden, they're updating all the standards. So that's one change in the quality profession that I don't think too many people anticipated 4 years ago. Now, 7 years ago in 2015, ISO 9001 came out. And incorporated in that standard was this concept called risk-based thinking. Again, another problem. You can't audit somebody's thinking unless you pass Mind Reading 101. You can't develop audit evidence. There's no mental audit trail. There's no artifacts. In other words, ISO never defined risk-based thinking, but incorporated it into the world's biggest used standard, ISO 9001, 2015. Let me say that again. They incorporated a concept, 3 words, risk-based thinking, into the world's biggest standard and never defined it. So what happens is everybody interpreted it differently, applied it differently, and operationalized it differently. But big problem, you can't audit somebody's thinking. Second problem is it goes against the fundamentals of quality and reliability, one of which is consistency. Another way to think about quality is consistency, the application of consistency in your product, your process, your organization. But if everybody's doing something different, you have inconsistency, and which implies poor quality, maybe even poor reliability. So you have to basically 2 million companies now have to reframe and redefine risk and risk-based thinking. So the solution, which we'll be discussing a lot in this talk, is we define risk-based thinking in terms of 2 things: risk-based problem solving, risk-based decision making. Why? Well, RBPS, risk-based problem solving, and risk-based decision making offer artifacts. You have an audit trail. You have inputs and assumptions that are written. And more importantly, you can audit against that. The third thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of quality being disrupted is that ISO 31000, the International Risk Management Standard, or I should say guideline, specifically says it's not to be used for certification. But guess what? Risk is being such a critical issue for companies that somebody's going to take advantage of it. As that old maxim says, the marketplace hates a unmet need. Somebody's going to fill that need. And what we have are large global mega companies like BSI, ANOR, and TUV in Germany, basically offering certificates. Now, again, the guideline is not for certification, but again, there's a market need and companies are meeting that market need. And this is causing a lot of disruption, quality, and in reliability standards. So the first part of our discussion was context. In this part, we're going to come up with a response. So we talked about the context, we talked about the challenges, and now we're going to talk about some solutions. And here's a great quote from Ram Charan. And the quote basically says, taking control of uncertainty, or VUCA, is a fundamental leadership challenge of our time. And I would basically say that taking control of uncertainty to best of our ability is our personal challenge of our time. Obviously, from an organizational point of view, threats and opportunities are much bigger because of coronavirus, fires, right now, inflation, stagflation, unfortunately. And I think what we have to do now is reevaluate our role in the whole challenge. Right now, companies are reevaluating the future of work, their business models, hybrid work, make or buy decisions, reshoring ISO systems. I think you as quality and reliability professionals need to reevaluate your future and make decisions through the risk lens. So I'm going to now start talking about risk-based problem solving and risk-based decision making. In this graph, you can see points of similarity and points of differences. And again, I'm not going to read these. You can read these on your own, or please reach out to Fred and he'll send you the deck. Again, one more plug for Fred. Get engaged with Ascendo. Great platform, free information, and you'll learn a lot. So anyway, basically in this graph, you can see points of similarity, points of difference. I'm going to go through these slides sometimes in detail, but I'm not going to read them off. One of the things that we're seeing right now, and we're going to talk about this in the next 5 slides, is VUCA. Again, we talked about what VUCA is: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Volatility essentially is, well, just what volatility means. Lots of variation, lots of dynamic change. Uncertainty is lack of predictability. One way to think of uncertainty is, and somebody on LinkedIn yesterday said I was an idiot, and that's fine, because I define uncertainty differently than what he thought, and he had a PhD. But essentially, uncertainty is a lack of predictability. Another way to think about that is cause and effect is really doesn't even exist because there's too many factors, too many unknowns. And really, you're going to be doing correlation analysis as opposed to causal analysis. Complexity basically means that things that were easy to understand, maybe even 3-5 years ago, are much more complex. A lot of issues: social, people, political, identity, technical, and ambiguity. Ambiguity essentially is the fog of reality, the fog of business, the fog of competition. Anyway, we'll discuss those over the next couple of slides. And what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation is decision making. Because if you remember a previous slide, I think our ability as professionals, quality professionals, reliability professionals, our ability to make smart, reliable, consistent decisions right now will offer more value than a machine. And again, that may change in 5 years, max maybe 10 years. What surprises me, and I've been playing with one of the major AI packages for a number of years is how smart it's getting, not monthly, but daily. But anyway, over the next 4 slides, we're going to be talking about decision-making under volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I'm going to offer 2 types of options. Old school, which is the way we made decisions, maybe even pre-COVID, and then new school, what I think the future of decision-making is going to be, or another way to think about it, new school is risk-based decision-making. Anyway, I'm not going to read these slides. If you've got questions, please ask them in your chat or ask them or email Fred, email me. But if you've got questions, please reach out. In this slide, we're talking about uncertainty. And again, uncertainty is the second.
Greg?
Yes, sir.
I think before you dive into the details of this one is take a look at the chat window. Carl's brought up a question and a comment that you might find interesting.
Yes, thank you. I haven't read that. And by the way, thank you for reaching out. Yes. I think Carl DuPont is right on the money. Is this part of the great reset that's happening now? The only constant is change. Agreed? Yes, I agree. The piece that I would add to that is the velocity and even the acceleration, the second derivative of change is increasing. And I think a lot of us as professionals, and I'll just talk about myself, are still locked into old models of thinking, old models of doing. Why? Because they worked. And now I have to sort of reevaluate stuff. Another quick story. Somebody, Fortune 500 company, probably globally, sent me a specification the other day and wanted me to review their system, quality system. And I thought, this is really interesting. It works under old management methods, but I wouldn't suggest that it would work right now. And I had to tell the client in a sort of a soft way that, oh, the system that you have right now works, but have you thought of this, this, and this, and this? And in the memo, which was a very quick memo, was 6 pages, single-spaced. And I agree with Carl again, living like a tree in the woods, we are either living and growing or we are dying. As humans, human behavior sometimes is very difficult to change. I think in my case, it's very difficult to change in some cases. And that's going to be a big challenge for organizations, governments. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge will be governments. How are they going to adapt? But yes, good point, Carl. Thank you. I appreciate that. Anyway, here's the uncertainty slide. The next one will be complexity, and the one after that will be ambiguity. Again, old school is old school management and decision-making. New school is new risk-based problem solving and risk-based decision-making. And essentially, that's the essence. These should be the new school should be our differentiators for adding value, personal value, organizational value. And please, if you got questions or comments, please add them to the chat, because I learn just as well, and probably I learn as much as you do probably. Anyway, here's ambiguity. Old school decision-making, new school decision-making. And even though I try to practice new school, the reality is I fall back to what I feel comfortable, which is often old school decision-making and problem solving. So now I'm going to get into the how-to, what is and how-to phase. So let's, in terms of risk-based decision-making. So first of all, let's define risk. We'll go from risk and we'll go into much more complex functions of decision making in a couple minutes. So essentially, risk is defined by ISO 31000 as the effective uncertainty on objectives. Big problem. And they finally admitted it last month, unfortunately 4 years too late, that you can't audit to that, you can't operationalize that, you can't do anything with that. And unfortunately, millions of companies have attempted it in the meantime. What we advocate and what the US TAG and Global TAG recommends is you add 2 words, the achievement of objectives. Again, this is not in the standard. I think in the update, it certainly will be. Another definition of risk is the possibility that an event will occur that adversely affects the achievement of objectives. This is really the financial definition of risk. Essentially, 99% of global companies have adopted this last definition called the COSO definition. The problem with this definition is when you're basically doing a risk model or developing a risk register, you're going to be looking at every event, real, imagined, possible, and you're going to have a risk register of 10, 20,000 events. And you basically can't manage that type of system. So the problem with this definition is that this definition tries to boil the ocean. And the ocean in this case are all possible risks. And the solution in this case is focus on the critical few risks, not the insignificant many. So, second thing I want to introduce is what's a framework. And it's really called an RMF, Risk Management Framework. A framework basically is a structure or a hierarchy to build strategy, reach objectives, and monitor performance. This is the essence of risk management. Those 3 issues: have a strategy, reach objectives, and monitor performance. They can be organizational, enterprise level, they can be programmatic, project process, or even product reliability objectives. So basically, a framework is a set of controls. So at this point, I want to bring up an important point. And this is really the essence of the rest of our talk. When you think of risk, you automatically should think of a control. Just like you can't define good without bad, you can't define 0 without 1, you cannot define risk without a control. Another way to think about it is, if you have a risk, you're going to have a control. If you have a control for anything, the control basically is trying to mitigate that risk. The other really important comment on frameworks is a framework is really a set of controls. So let's look at this from a company's perspective. It's 2022. The month is June. The stock market, NASDAQ, almost all of them have hit bear territory in the last 2 days. Their stock price has tanked. Amazon, almost every stock has gone down at least 20 points. The stock market has gone down 20% from its high. You're an executive in a large firm. Doesn't matter. I mean, I looked at the stock price of Disney, 50% down. Almost every tech stock down 20, 30, 50%. The stock prices, anyway, you're an executive and you're saying, gee, uncertainty, risk, more VUCA. What am I going to do? We can basically do what we've been doing, or we can figure out where do we want to go? Meaning, what's our business model? How do we want to get there? And what type of controls are we going to have to ensure that we can meet our strategic objectives? Again, risk and controls go together. And more executives and more companies are going to be thinking in terms of developing their own risk management frameworks. Let me say that again. We're reaching a point in our economy of stagflation. I went through the 70s. I remember 17% stagflation. The economy would grow 2%. Inflation would grow 17, 19%, and the delta would be 17% negative. And that went on for years. I really hope we don't go there, but the reality is the economy is slipping. And again, the executives see risk, and they're going to be looking at risk management frameworks. And we're going to be talking about that for about 5 minutes. So please bear with me. So I'm going to look at 3 types of risk management frameworks so I can at least introduce them to you. This is a really key idea that every company is looking at. If you're going to go into consulting right now, this is the area that I would recommend. Every ISO standard has risk. Every financial standard has risk. In the US right now, most legislation coming out of Washington has a risk requirement in it. Could be an ERM, enterprise risk management requirement. It could be a risk assessment. For example, I'll just bring in 4 areas. ESG, environmental sustainability, is a risk requirement. There's a $1.3 trillion domestic infrastructure build out. It has risk. The AI standards coming out of NIST, all risk-based. All the standards coming out of IEEE, not all, but I'll put it this way, all the standards coming out of ISO have a risk component to it. So I'm going to introduce you to the 3 major RMFs, risk management frameworks. Remember that acronym, because normally people don't spell out RMF. So RMF is risk management framework. So here are 3 guidelines I'm going to introduce you to. First is NIST. This is the cybersecurity risk framework. Latest just came out on from Department of Defense 3 days ago. They want this whole standard updated. Why? It's very difficult to operationalize. The second type of framework that I'm going to introduce you to is the ISO framework. It's called ISO 31000. It's an ERM framework, enterprise risk management. I call it LIGHT. It's a global document. This is the framework, by the way, where they defined risk improperly. You can see the framework on the right. It's got 8 components to it. It follows a cycle. It's very circular. That on the right is called its architecture. And you can see the architecture has to be tailored to the organization. And we're going to talk about the tailoring in a minute. But that framework is the one that we use in reliability and quality almost 100% of the time. The next framework that I'm going to introduce, the COSO framework, is used by 100% of the companies that are on the NASDAQ. This is the risk management framework that has the enterprise focus to it. It has really 3, it's a box, it's a cube. On the front part of the cube, it's got the steps to it. On the upper part, it's got basically the organizational areas, strategic operations. And on the right-hand side, basically, it's got the different levels: entity, business unit, division, business, and subsidiary. Anyway, this is called the COSO framework. And the COSO stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. It includes the management accountants, certified public auditors, financial executives. Anyway, every large company in the world that's publicly traded has to have an ERM program. It's called a listing requirement. And this is the RMF that they use from the enterprise level. So how do these things work? Normally, a company will have an ERM, Enterprise Risk Management Framework, which is called the COSO Cube. And then basically they take the ERM framework, the one you see on top, and they deploy it through the organization. ISO 31000 normally is not deployed at the enterprise level, it's deployed at the project or process level through the organization. I hope that makes sense. So here's another option. And whether you're dealing with COSO or whether you're dealing with the cybersecurity NIST framework, or if you're dealing with ISO, every one of these frameworks has to be tailored to the culture of the organization, its risk appetite, or its context. So let me sort of talk about that for a second. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you have FDA requirements that you need to address. By the way, FDA, Food Drug Administration, all risk-based. You basically design and architect your framework, your risk management framework, to the context of the organization. So the RMF of a pharmaceutical shop is going to be different than a small manufacturing shop that would probably use ISO 31000, and it would be basically tailored to operations. If you're using a RMF for reliability, you'd focus at the process level and probably integrate your RMF with a FEMA, failure mode effects analysis. So anyway, we'll talk about that. In our case, we're a company, a small company. And what we do is take an RMF and do 4 things. And this is our approach. You can think of it as architect, design, deploy, and assure, ADA. We've got a trademark on it. And what we essentially do is we take a risk management framework and first architect it to the organization so it can meet its strategic objectives. So we take a bunch of frameworks and we say, okay, based on their context, based upon their needs, their business model, their operating model, we basically structure the framework to fit the organization. And again, we may design a framework, RMF, for the enterprise and a different framework for a business unit, and even a different framework for a PMO, Program Management Office. Second thing we do is we tailor the framework to the organization. So as you notice, a framework, in this case here, internal environment, objective setting, event identification, we'll take each one of those and tailor that and the controls to the organization. Meaning we'll set up a risk control structure for the organization and tailor it to the specific process, specific objectives at the programmatic, project, and process level. Next thing we do in our work is we deploy the framework to the organization or even into the supply chain. And then finally, we close out the framework by developing assurance mechanisms so that the framework, and you can think of a framework as a system of risk controls throughout the organization so that the company, the organization, the enterprise, the process, project can meet its objectives efficiently, effectively, and economically. And we basically do that by mitigating risk based upon the organizational appetite. Now, interestingly, the organizational appetite has to be deployed throughout the organization and can be different for different parts of the organization. For example, if you have a construction project, they may say, okay, we don't want to have anything more than 5% change orders. That 5% is their risk appetite for cost overruns. They could have a different risk appetite for their schedule or for their scope or even for quality. But anyway, you can get the idea. In our case, what we do is we look at architect, design, deploy, and assure, and we use that as our risk PDCA. Now in quality, reliability, PDCA stands for Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's a Deming concept. Well, in risk, there is a new vocabulary, a new system, a new process. Our process really is using the RMF, risk management framework, but we have to close that out. And we close that out by assuring that the risk controls are working effectively economically. So I'll talk about each one of these pieces. Architecting the RM framework, here's a bunch of things we do. And I'm not going to read these, but you get an idea of what we do. And again, this is our equivalent in risk management, enterprise risk management, for designing a set of controls, a system of controls that meet objectives within the risk appetite of the organization. Our next thing is designing. We actually will take each element of the framework that we have architected and design it in terms of each one of these elements. Actually, there's probably 30 elements of this, but you can get an idea or a flavor for what we do. Again, this is a brand new area for reliability. This is a brand new area for quality. And we think really this is the future of consulting. The deployment is what we do here. And again, deploying the RM framework, risk management framework. Now, normally the first two pieces, the architecting and designing, are very technical. The deploying is really an HR function. It's a human, it's an organizational development function. First two are fairly straightforward. This takes 80 to 90% of the time because we're dealing with behaviors, we're dealing with culture, we're dealing with people. People don't want to change, they're risk averse. In the meantime, the organization wants to change very quickly. And we have that sort of that pull-push dynamic going on. Then finally, assuring the framework. We're closing it out. We have to make sure that the objectives can be met and achieved. And then very often, we have to set up a board reporting structure. Every publicly held company, let me say this again, every publicly held company throughout the world has a risk committee at the board. And they want to know that the controls are in place, objectives are being met, and the objectives are being met based on the risk appetite of the organization. And part of this is closing out the loop, the PDCA loop and risk, is assuring that risk controls are effective, efficient, and economic. So one of the questions we ask is, gee, can't we do this with a risk assessment? So this is an important concept that I want to talk about. And again, this chart here is the chart for ISO 31000. If you're a purist, according to ISO, you're only going to be doing a risk assessment of three things. You're going to identify the risks, analyze the risks, and evaluate the risks. That's it. No more. What happens is a lot of people now throughout the world are conflating, confusing, or integrating the concept of risk assessment and risk management. Risk management is really the bottom part, treating the risk, mitigating the risk, managing the risk. A risk assessment simply looks at the looks at the as-is state. Risk management looks at the delta between the as-is state and the to-be state. If the delta between the to-be and the as-is too big, you're going to have more controls. If the delta between the to-be and the as-is is very little, then basically you may not have to add any more controls. Why? Because that's within your risk appetite. But here we get almost a lot of confusion between a lot of professionals about what the true difference is, because professionals, even who have been in this 20 years, tend to conflate or confuse or integrate risk management with risk assessment. So Fred wanted me to talk about risk assessment tools. ISO 31000 lists all of these as tools. to conduct a risk assessment. Everything from a Bayesian analysis, which is a statistical decision, a type of analysis, Markov chains, to even a checklist. Yes, even a checklist is a risk assessment tool. I can talk about any one of these. The important takeaway from all these tools is that use the right tool in the right application and tailor it. Because a lot of folks that we see, especially right now, because risk management and RMFs have become hugely popular in almost every discipline, people are conflating, and using the wrong tool with the wrong assumptions in the wrong application. We do a lot of that type of analysis quite often. When an assessment has failed, we're brought in to clean things up. So you have essentially probably 33, 32 different risk assessment tools. Use the right tool in the right application with the right assumptions and with the right data. That's our takeaway. So here's a final thought on how to prosper in these disruptive times. And this basically is a quote from our favorite Charles Darwin. It's not the strongest, it's not the most intelligent, it's really the most adaptable that will survive and prosper. So with that said, I want to say thank you to Fred. Thank you to Accendo, and hopefully can answer some of your questions. By the way, the screen early on, but I showed you a project that we're doing with Oregon State University. We're building an app on the future work. Well, the opening splash screen of our app you can see on the right. Anyway, I'm here to answer some questions or try to answer some questions. Anything you want me to cover, Fred? Hello?
Yeah, no, I'm got to find the mic button. Both the chat and the Q&A tabs, we're taking a look at those. If you got any questions,
Okay.
Jeremiah gave us a nice, I think, hopefully not as an abrupt an analogy or history lesson. Isn't there something about history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it repeats the themes or something like that?
Yeah, there was a Spanish philosopher that basically said that history tends to repeat itself. Interestingly, who's that? There's a billionaire who wrote a book on.
Well, that doesn't narrow it down.
Yeah, on history repeating itself in terms of economic cycles. But Jeremiah, Mr. Todd, I think is pretty much right on the money. Any questions or comments beyond that? Please write in your chat and I'll try to address these.
Well, as you remember, Greg, well, thanks for the shout outs for Accendo. That wasn't necessary, but because these people already know about Accendo, so we're in good shape there. And a lot of familiar faces there too. But a couple months ago, somebody asked a question basically about that assessment and what's a framework and those kinds of things. So I think you covered those. And that was somebody sending over questions for a topic for a future webinar. So we always appreciate it when we get that. So naturally, I thought of you, Greg, to take this on.
Okay.
Oh, Warren Buffett did the quote you were looking for there, that book. He's a billionaire that qualifies as somebody that wrote a book.
Yeah. In our case right now, and I really hope we don't have stagflation. I remember it in the late 70s. It was awful. It was brutal. But what we're going to see are more companies, unfortunately, using risk management to ensure their survivability. And I think
you're already seeing it, Greg. There's like Tesla announced last week, they're laying off, I don't know, 10% or a whole pile of people. Companies are pulling back from investments and capital improvements, kind of as a hedge.
Yep.
And I imagine that's, a variation of risk-based decision making, going, well, what can we do to, if the scenarios that we're expecting pan out, how do we proactively guard ourselves from those? And so we're seeing some of that.
Yes, and unfortunately, people tend sometimes to be the fallout from a lot of that. Okay, human and the natural world are creatures of habit. The path of least resistance. Agreed. So the path of least resistance is a decision. It's basically risk aversion. Not making decision, is a risk decision. We're going to have a lot of risk decisions being made, both personally as well as organizationally. And what I would advocate is that if you want to set up a practice, focus on risk management frameworks. It's going to be a great area to be in, because all the standards that I'm seeing, and I cover these daily, have a risk component to them. Fight or flight. Yes. Is that a risk decision? Absolutely. Fighting, risk taking, fleeing, risk aversion. Are you going to be a farmer, or are you going to be a gatherer or a hunter? A hunter, same thing. Risk taking. If you're going to be a gatherer, still important, don't get me wrong. Risk basically probably sensitive. So there are a whole bunch of metaphors that you can use that really, at its base, deal with risk-based decision making.
Oh, I think one last thought here, Greg, as we wrap it up, is this fight or flight idea. You've heard the joke, two guys are sitting in the savannah and a lion is poking her head through the brush, and one guy stops to tie his shoes. And his buddy says, "What are you doing? We got to get out of here." And he goes, "Well, I just have to get out of here faster than you."
Absolutely. Yeah, munch. And again, insurance is a form of decision making. It's risk hedging.
Yeah. Now there's a lot to it. So we're going to have to see what kind of questions we get, follow up on this. And if there's other topics related to risk and risk management, risk topics in general, let us know. And we'll get Greg back over here to explore that and chat about it some more. So thanks again for everybody attending, combination of new people and familiars. So thanks again for showing up. In a couple of weeks, Chris Jackson's back on, and we'll go from there. As usual, I forget whatever our future topics are. We'll be letting you know. So thanks so much again, Greg, for jumping on, and have a great rest of your day. Let me go ahead and end the recording. Thanks everybody for attending. And